what, tens, hundreds, thousands of Jewish believers who left a trail of widows and orphans behind within the church. Because now Paul's seeing the depth of while believing I was serving God, I was opposing God and putting to death his people. And it's precisely because of the depth of his opposition that God finally knocked him off his donkey or whatever it was on the road. He was on his way to Damascus to arrest Jewish believers and bring them back and have them put in prison and to death. And God opened his eyes. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus whom you are opposing with all your might and all your learning and all your ability. And I will use you now to bring the gospel of grace, because the fact that I have restored you, it's like a resurrection from the dead. You have nothing to boast of, and you never will. And you know and understand the grace and forgiveness of God in a way more profound than any man who has ever lived, I think including David in his sin. Because should we sin all the more so that God has more to forgive? Paul said, may it never be. But where sin has abounded and been great, grace abounds all the more. That was true in Paul, and that qualified Paul to bring the gospel of grace to the Gentiles, who had no advantages. But he knew the grace and forgiveness of God in a way beyond any man who has ever lived. And Paul is a picture in his own life of Israel. A nation, a whole nation, that has gone further in rejection of God, believing that they're serving and honoring God. They are in fact opposing him and have said, crucify him, give us Barabbas, and we will defend and be champions of the law. That nation, precisely because their rejection and opposition has been greater than that of any other people. When I bring them sovereignly in a way that they could never come to themselves, to repentance and open their eyes, and they come to faith in the Messiah they have rejected for 2,000 years, it will be like resurrection from the dead. And when they then bring this gospel to all the nations, it will be with a power and an authority, because how could this possibly be? If you had grown up in Brooklyn in a Jewish family and gone to an Orthodox synagogue, or if you go to Israel and see a nation that is fiercely and intensely proud and self-reliant and incredibly accomplished, and has fought off 100 million Arab opponents seeking to wipe out that nation in their fierce self-reliance and determination, you would say, there is no way. There is no way that this nation could ever come to believe what they have scorned and rejected. And God says, precisely. Because it will be unquestionably my choosing and my grace, and not them coming to some decision that has brought them to repentance and faith. And they will be to the world what Paul was to all the nations, because it's a sovereign choosing. You were.
Well, I just was going to say, can you see now, a lot of times when we talk to people, they'll say, well, why Israel? Is Israel more special than any other nation? But can you see by what he's talking about here that the choosing of Israel is precisely to show how a people, and therefore it's applicable to individuals, can be given absolutely every advantage, and yet not come to God. When you see that, and you see that God nevertheless has made promises that He will keep, that's what gives the rest of the church a confidence and a security that God's going to keep us. So that's the purpose behind this, this whole master plan. I think when we see that, it changes everything. And the other thing, Paul, I don't know whether you're going to yet bring it out or not, but in these chapters he talks about using the Gentile church to make the Jews jealous. It's all part of his plan. That when the Jews see, or us, even though Paul and I are Jewish, we're part of the Gentile church. When they see us and our relationship with God and our love for God, that's what makes them jealous. So we as a church have a great calling in this respect, not just towards the Chinese people, which of course you have, but also to the Jews.
I told you we wouldn't get through 3 chapters, and I'm aware of the time. But we need to land on, while we're still together and awake, well, and how far to go with this. Paul raises the question that you have to ask. Paul goes on to say, God chooses whom He chooses, and He hardens whom He chooses to harden. And it's like Paul says, I know what you're thinking. Let me tell you what you think. Is God then unjust? How can He's holding me responsible, but His will is behind everything. So is God unjust to judge and condemn me for not believing, when I couldn't have believed except that He, in some sense, caused me to believe? It's a very big question. I studied and taught philosophy back in the East Coast a long time ago, before I was a lawyer. And the whole question of free will and determinism was, I just kind of broke my head over that. How do you work through that? And now I'm a believer, and I'm reading the Apostle Paul, and I think this is a mind exceeding that of any of the philosophers that I read and studied. And I'm working my way through Romans 9, and he's asking my question. Why am I still responsible? I'm missing the exact verse. Verse 19, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? And I was kind of holding my breath. Paul's going to answer this enormous question. And here's his answer. But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? I was very disappointed. This is not the answer that I was looking for. He goes on. Who are you to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder? Well, that's a mystery. Will the clay say to the potter, the one who is making the pot? Will the clay say to the potter, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honored use and another for dishonorable use? And then he goes on, and given the time, I can't work through the details of Paul's argument, but just to land right there for the moment, and then I want to just embed it in a few Old Testament scriptures for you. What is Paul saying? And this is what I have come